Good day. My name is John Quarstein, and I am the Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center at the Mariners Museum and Park. And as part of my duties there, I have to do a lot of writing. And so I decided, or I didn't decide, other people decided for me, that I needed to write a book about the commander of the Monitor, John Lomer Worden. So, and actually, a friend of mine is the descendant of John Lomer Worden, who worked at the Library of Congress for over 40 years and was deeply interested in the Worden family, genealogy, everything like that. A brilliant scholar. So, um, Robert and I went to the U.S. Naval Institute and said, hey, don't you all want a book about the founder of the United States Naval Institute? And yes, Worden was one of the founders. And they said, sure. And so Robert and I set across writing this book that is coming out on April 15, 18, excuse me, 15 April 2025. I have that problem about 19th century stuff. So we'll have some events at the Mariners Museum. I think one big one is scheduled for the 3rd of May. Now, Robert wrote most of the work about Worden when not at war. I, in turn, ended up writing everything about Worden at war and Worden's influence or support for trying to make the Navy better, even though it was very parsimonious after the Civil War. And in doing so, I learned a lot. Robert learned a lot. And so it was a great partnership, one of the best partnerships I've ever had in my writing career. So this is my 21st book, believe it or not. And so slide, please. I think John Lomer Worden, is a New Yorker. Slide, please. Yes. And he, was born in 1818. He was related to the Graham family of New York, who had several ancestors, great grandfather, so forth, that served in the War of 1812. So Worden grew up in that household for him to get better schooling in New York City. Consequently, he was drawn into service in the U.S. Navy. And so he becomes a midshipman in 1834, and he will be assigned to several ships, one of them being the USS Erie. And slide, please. Another one will be the USS Cayenne. And so on all these ships, he's a midshipman. He forms some friendships that are going to last throughout his career, including one man known as Henry Augustus Wise, who was a very brilliant officer, ordnance expert, as well as a author. Harry Gringo was his pen name, and so he wrote about cruises and kind of made a bunch of stuff. But Worden actually has a different name, but he's in the book because you can tell by say about what they did together. So this is very important. So slide, please. Robert Worden is going to actually get the opportunity to work here, as you see in the slide, the U.S. Naval Observatory. And that is where Matthew Fontaine Maury was producing his books, his research about tides. And one way to improve navigation is, of course, shooting the stars. And so one of the big things Worden did was meticulously research and record his work with, so-called stargazing, which all was taken by Maury and put into these books on navigation. Maury was always behind in producing them. But what was great about the U.S. Naval Observatory is that every logbook, every chart that was used on a ship as it returned to the United States, they were all sent to the Naval Observatory and Depot of Charts so that Maury and his various midshipmen and lieutenants could go through that information, summarize it. Maury then would say, "Wow, that's called the Gulf Stream," and things like that, which was really great. And this added to Worden's career. In fact, he is called a scientific officer because of his work at the Naval Observatory, which is really great for him. Now, he's at the Naval Observatory, slide please, when the Mexican War breaks out. And he, of course, he goes as executive officer of the store ship Southampton. They actually leave from Gosport Navy Yard, and he spends 2 years out in the Pacific, and particularly he partially sees combat during the U.S. conquest of Baja California. So wow, he is he lands with blue jackets and Marines, saves San Juan de Cabo from the Mexicans capturing it from a small Marine garrison. He actually will be commander of his first ship, a prize schooner known as the Esmeralda, where they're going capturing various Mexican suspicious ships. And so they will go through that in a so Worden, actually at this time you start to see all of his ailments. And Worden, we are pretty sure, suffered from kidney stones and gallstones, which anyone who's had them knows that that's very uncomfortable, and there's no real solution back then for them. So Worden is not considered sickly, but he spends a lot of time when he's in Mexico. Well, when the Mexican War is over, right after that, in various hospital ships. So slide, please. And so he's working after the war. He goes on comes back to the New York Navy Yard. He then becomes he's passed to lieutenant. He becomes member of the crew of the USS Cumberland during its tour of the Mediterranean. And so when he comes back, he's going to be assigned again to the Brooklyn Navy Yard as his executive officer. These are all real building blocks for Worden to make. Now, Worden is happy being in Brooklyn Navy Yard. His family is there, and all of a sudden he gets orders to join this picture is of the frigate Savannah, but it had been received down to a sloop and at Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so he's named executive officer of the Savannah. Worden writes the Navy Department, "Look, I don't want this job. If I want to be on the Coastal Survey," which would have meant he would have been based out of New York, surveying our coast. And Worden says he has pressing family issues. And so, but the Navy says, "Too bad, you're on the Savannah." So while he's on the Savannah, and this is 1859, he will actually participate in the Battle of Anton Lazaro, which There's conservatives and reformists in Mexico. They're all jockeying for leadership of Mexico. Meanwhile, Mexico's borrowed a lot of money from France and England. They want their money back. And so, Worden is there when they capture two pirate ships. They call them pirate ships because they were not Mexican, formerly in the Mexican Navy. So, anyway, Worden becomes sickly when he comes back, and he's assigned, slide please, to the. He gets to go home actually because of his kidney ailments, and then all of a sudden, this is um, April 1861. He gets contacted directly by Gideon Wells. And Gideon Wells has him come to Washington, and they're all assured that he is a loyal American officer. And this is real important because he gets a special duty, which is to take secret dispatches down to Pensacola. This is one of the forts defending Pensacola. And I'm going to tell you, there are two other forts, Fort Gracchus and Fort McRae, but there's also a Navy Yard there, the Warrington Navy Yard. And this could have been a great resource had the Confederates captured it. Now, all along the Gulf, they've already captured every fort worthwhile. And so the station commander, Henry Adams, has a secret agreement or an agreement with the local Confederates that I won't land any troops to support Port Pickens, because that's where Adam Semler and his garrison all went, and he had just over 60 men. And so Worden comes down to Pensacola. He sees Braxton Bragg saying, I need to see Captain Adams. He says, do you have any dispatches for him? Worden says, no, I don't, because on the way down, Worden's wearing his U.S. Navy uniform. He doesn't care. And so he's got Confederate troops on the trains. So he goes and destroys the actual dispatches after memorizing everything. So he tells Bragg no. And so he goes to the fleet and gives Adams all this information. You need to land the troops. Remember, it's either Pensacola or Charleston where this war is going to happen. So he is such a trusted officer, he gets sent down there. Well, he delivers the dispatches verbally. He comes back to Pensacola. He doesn't check in with Bragg. He heads back to the north, of course, wearing his uniform, and he gets captured, and he is the first POW of the Civil War. And it actually, Worden becomes a big cause for Mrs. Worden, who said, oh, my husband's going to die in prison. It's terrible. He's sickly, blah, blah, blah. So finally, they develop an exchange program, which is done first by Major General Benjamin Huger and Major General John Ellis Wool of the Union Army. So Worden gets exchanged. He goes back to New York, goes home, and his wife says, "Oh, he's so sickly, and it's everything's terrible." And all of a sudden, he gets a letter from Flag Officer Joseph Smith, who says, I think you're the right sort of individual to take command of this experimental vessel, Erickson's Battery. So, despite his wife saying, oh, you're too sick to go, he goes down to Brooklyn and he sees the ship and he writes Smith and says, I feel I can be the agent to prove this vessel a success. Slide, please. Well, you have to realize this is an untried warship, as we all know. And being untried, Worden has to come up with how many men he needs, how, everything that the ship is going to have to do. He has to regulate and come up with plans how this ship is not only going to go to sea, but also, and going to sea, let me tell you, in the Monitor, um, there were two men that volunteered for the Monitor, and as soon as they arrived on it, they deserted. Because with an 18-inch freeboard, you are a little worried about how well you're going to handle the seas. So we mix all these plans. The ship only almost sinks twice on the way down to Hampton Roads, and when they come in, they are a day late. The CSS Virginia, formerly known as the Merrimack, will have already attacked the Union fleet and have actually sank two capital ships, captures one merchant ship, destroys two other merchant ships, damages an armed tug, the Zouave, and of course damages the steam screw frigate Minnesota and the sailing frigate St. Lawrence. The Virginia on March 8, 1862, proved the power of Iron River Wood. Worden shows up. He goes to the Minnesota as ordered by John Marsden, and he goes, I'm here on the little Monitor. And imagine being up on a frigate looking down. I mean, the Monitor, the top of the turret is 9 feet off the water's edge. And so the commander of the Minnesota, Gershon Jacques Henry Van Brunt, looks down and says, "What are you?" Worden says, "I'm the Monitor. I'm here to protect you. Go do what you want. If that ship comes back out, I'll sink before surrender." Worden says, "I will protect you." And on the next day, Worden does exactly that. And he does it in a very effective way. He has to keep the Virginia away from the Minnesota, and generally they do very effectively. The battle ends when Worden in the pilot house is going to be grievously wounded by a shell fired by John Taylor Wood. Wow. Worden has to be taken to Washington. He will recover in Henry Augustus Wise's house. Slide, please. And he is, I will tell you, very badly injured. And this, of course, the map of Hampton Roads. So most of the fight with the Monitor is, if you can look at this map, right where you see above the words federal buildings, that's called Salters Creek. And that's where the Minnesota is run aground off of that. So that's where the battle takes place right there. Slide, please. So you can see, thanks to Worden's leadership, the Monitor, despite being partially damaged, is able to do its duty. You can see the pilot house, and you can see how they added sloped sides to it so that it was more protected than just a square box. Slide, please. So anyway, Worden goes back up to Quaker Hill, where he slowly recovers. I mean, this guy is blinded. Then they think, oh my gosh, he may lose his left eye. If you looked at him, he had gunpowder sparks in every pore in his face. He takes a long time to recuperate. It's very difficult. When you read the book, you'll understand his treatments. And gosh, I couldn't, that makes him great, just surviving the treatment, in my opinion. So he is recovering, and he is assigned to the Brooklyn Navy Yard to supervise the construction of a new class of Monitor, the Passaic. You can see a Passaic class ship right there. That is the Montauk. Now, what makes the Montauk different than the Monitor? Well, it's longer. It's got permanent smokestacks, and it has the pilot house on top of the turret. All that did, it gave better ways of communicating with the gunnery crew. However, it was a sitting target. And Worden will later say that a shell hit the pilot house, broke off bolts, which all flew around him. You can imagine the type of man Worden is going into combat in the pilot house, just like where he was wounded, and it doesn't have enough iron. The Confederates at Fort McAllister, as you'll see in the background where the other flag is, that's Fort McAllister on Genesis Point. However, Worden's duties were to number one, test the Montauk and its firepower. And he does so. It's an earthen fort, so the weaponry Worden has is not as effective against a earthwork than it would be against um, uh, a masonry fort. However, he also had the job of cutting the Savannah, Florida Railroad, which where you see the exploding ship right beyond there is where the Florida and Savannah Railroad crosses the big Okeechee River. Man, they cut that. That is doomsday for Richmond in many ways. That's how all the supplies are coming up from the deep south. But also there, he has orders to destroy that pesky ship, the CSS Nashville. Now, by this time, the Nashville had changed names twice. It was then known as the Rattlesnake. However, word and the ship comes down to take advantage of the flood ties in the spring, and it ran aground. And Worden sees it. He says, okay, there's a line of instructions. He goes, well, what we're going to do tomorrow is go up to this position and we're going to shell it. And no matter what Fort McAllister does to us, we don't care. So he's got an 11-inch Dahlgren, a 15-inch Dahlgren. He tries two ranging shots. Wow. And a total of 11 shells will be sent at the Nashville. And the Nashville catches fire and blows up. I mean, when they're in the pilot house, actually, they get out on the deck before they move into range of Fort McAllister. And they said, oh, the ship was perfectly painted and everything. And so Worden destroys the ship. Wow, he's a hero once again, because he said, I was honored to dispatch the pain in our naval defenses. And in other words, Nashville was a very fast commerce raider at one time. And it's the first commerce raider of the Civil War, only sank two ships, but nevertheless, it was a big symbol in the North. So if you think about February 28, 1863, this is a major thing. Now, slide, please. The Montauk this is my favorite picture of Worden. He, by this time, is promoted to captain, and he, of course, does not destroy Fort McAllister. Actually, on the way down the big Okeechee River, after sinking the Nashville, his Monitor will hit a torpedo and blows a crack into the hull of the Montauk. Now, one of the biggest troubles that they did when they got a contract to do more monitors, guess what? They didn't change the hull design, the deck design. So the hull was made of 1-inch boilerplate. So obviously, the explosion of the torpedo is very effective. Worden, slide please, runs it aground, and then they fix it and then go back down to Port Royal to prepare for the DuPont's ironclad attack on Charleston. Now, really, they never get beyond Fort Sumter, Why? There's a big row of obstructions, which the Federals think it's filled with torpedoes. Actually, John Rogers in the Weehawken will have a torpedo raft that Erickson had designed. Slows his vessel to 3 knots. It's terrible. It doesn't work. But if Erickson designed it, it was perfect to the U.S. Navy, except for those that use them. In fact, after, Worden will write a report after this battle and delivers it to Samuel Francis DuPont. And he basically says, look, these monitors, poor workmanship. You haven't solved the real problem of the overhang. The engines are too slow, which affects the steering. The pilot house needs lots more armor. And instead of having that 11-inch, you should put in either another 15-inch or a 100-pounder rifle. And so, because of the more effectiveness it would have against fixed fortifications, he, in that report, says, the Monitor is not to attack land fortifications. DuPont sends that forward. Of course, DuPont gets fired. Worden becomes very ill, and by this time, and eventually they will send him. DuPont sees him and says, "Look, you're very sickly. You can't. You got to go home." And so his final statement to his crew, where he thanked them for their readiness in carrying out his orders at all times, for their coolness when under enemy's fire, and also for their general good conduct. After taking a final leave of all, Worden stepped on to the blockade frigate Wabash's boat and proceeded amidst 3 hearty cheers to the Wabash and then back to New York. The big thing is that Worden now becomes an expert in monitors because of everything he says. He says they're bad vessels. And so Worden now will be assigned as Rear Admiral Francis Gregory's assistant for supervising the building of monitors. Now, remember, Worden is not an engineer, but he's learned a lot from the engineers, especially Thomas Stevens, who worked with him. So, they're encountering bad iron, bad bolts, all sorts of problems because of the cheapness of the workmanship. In other words, despite getting these big contracts, the shipyards are building substandard boats. But the Navy thinks the Monitor's the best. DuPont says, I wish those geniuses building these ships would listen to the people that use them. So the war ends. We don't really care about monitors anymore. I mean, he works on the Casco class, says they're terrible. He'll make a comment to Francis Gregory that if you put the turret and the gun on the ship, it will be 8 inches underwater. So that's 20 monitors that are built that are worthless by the end of the war. He then will become commander of the USS Idaho. And just to let you know, he then will become commander of the USS Pensacola. Pensacola is built down in Warrenton Navy Shipyard. It is using a radical engine system called the Dickerson engine. And because Dickerson had all this political pull and said, build my engines, they're better than the ones built by Benjamin Isherwood or John Erickson. And so they do. Now, the Pensacola engines don't work. It's a floating battery. And so it comes back up to Brooklyn. They build the Idaho. Henry Steers, this great clipper ship builder, will actually design the hull and the mast. However, Dickerson puts the engines in. The engines use twice as much coal. They're cantankerous. They need constant oiling and care. So when Worden comes back from the sea trials for the Idaho, he says, the engines are terrible. This is a great sailing ship. take the engines out and make it into a supply ship. And that's what the Navy does. So Worden has learned all this stuff about engines, ship design, monitors, and he puts it all to practice. He, of course, by this time is a captain. He then will actually go and take command of the. He took command of the Pensacola. Once again, it has Dickerson engines, and you have to take those out, put new ones in, and so he commands it going around the Horn and going all the way up to San Francisco. Um, so Worden now is a hero everywhere he goes. They name a street for him in San Francisco. Worden did not consider himself a hero for anything he did. He just thought, I'm doing my duty. That's all I really am supposed to do, and do my duty to the utmost. His report about the Battle of Charleston is very telling, where he makes it clear that monitors are not the perfect ship that Gideon Wells and Assistant Secretary Navy Gustavus Vasa Fox thought they were. Oh my gosh. He then Worden, after delivering the Pensacola, he will come back to Washington, where he'll go on leave in Europe for 2 years. He'll come back from that. He's named commandant of the U.S. Naval Academy. Wow. And he's there when they're changing curriculum. He's there when they welcome their first student of African descent, where they welcome the first Japanese students. This is when the academy is struck by hazing scandals, and Worden has to deal with that. I mean, he is promoted to Rear Admiral while he's at the academy. His last real major duty is going to be commander of the European squadron. And when he comes back, he serves on various boards and so forth. The U.S. Navy says, when he gets ready to retire, you get to be retired at full sea pay at your rank. That's how much they thought of it. Worden never wrote really anything about himself. Robert and I had the big problem of where we're going to get all this information. So we had to go through all the correspondence with the secretaries of Navy, from lieutenants, then commanders, then captains, and where we found all this information. Worden did have some papers. Most of those papers are at the Lincoln University in Harrogate, Tennessee, and at the beloved Mariners Museum. That's where I work. So anyway, and using those papers and the original reports, the log books, we get to put together the life of John Lorimer Worden. He didn't want to give speeches. He didn't want to write a book. He just wanted to do his duty. In fact, as I conclude in the new book, from Ironclads to Admiral, John Lorimer Worden, and Naval Leadership, I concluded Worden did not seek attention or consider himself a great man or hero, but in so many ways he was one. He fought in some of the Civil War's most dangerous and daring naval combat situation. Each time he did so, his service set new standards of leadership. He pushed the untested capabilities of the Monitor to the utmost by engaging the Virginia both in a circular fashion and at close quarters, even sinking to ram the rebel Ironclad. He tested the Montauk's armor close up under the furious barrage of Fort McAllister shore guns. His quickness in analyzing a situation and finalizing a viable solution enabled him to save the Montauk when it struck a torpedo. These actions and many more epitomize the well practiced skills and determination to achieve his goals. Worden's character, demeanor, and command qualities drew people to him and made them trust him with daring missions, command of experimental warships, and seemingly unsolvable problems. He led by example, and his steadfastness made others willing to follow his commands to achieve success. If Worden could do it, so can I. Thank you all.